More than 200 days have passed since Israel launched its war on Gaza in response to the attack by Hamas fighters that killed over 1,000 Israelis on October the 7th. The number of casualties keeps rising. More than 34,000 Palestinians have been killed, most of them women and children, and another 77,000 wounded. Thousands more are missing, believed to be buried under the rubble of homes, businesses, hospitals and schools. The UN says a child in Gaza is killed or wounded every 10 minutes, and 60% of all houses have been damaged or destroyed. And as the world waits for a ceasefire and an end to the violence, the question arises, what will the day after look like for Gaza once the war is over? To answer this, the United Nations appointed former Dutch Deputy Prime Minister Sigrid Kaag as Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. Her mission? To spearhead humanitarian relief and reconstruction efforts in the Strip. In her first long-format interview, the UN Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator Sigrid Kaag talks to Al Jazeera. Sigrid Kaag, Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza for the United Nations. Thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. Now, the last time you were on this programme was 15 months ago. Then you were the Deputy Prime Minister of the Netherlands. You served as your country's Foreign Minister and Finance Minister. Now you have arguably one of the toughest jobs in the world. The person you work for is the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, but some diplomats on the Security Council have told me the person who was really pushing for the job was the United States and the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. He wanted you to have this job. Does that help you in your task, having his backing?
Well, I think in general you need to have the support of the Council. It's always important to have obviously the key players, in this case a country such as the United States, be firmly rallying behind the purpose of the resolution, to have the support, but ultimately it's also my role to make sure that there's unity of purpose, that the voice and the members of the Council are behind the resolution and our mission. And then it's upon us, with that strong backing, to try to deliver under quite difficult and complex circumstances.
Let's look at your job, because it's mandated by a UN Security Council resolution. It's got two parts, humanitarian and reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. Let's start with the humanitarian part, because the humanitarian situation, I think you would agree, could not be more grim. We have the brutal bombardment of Gaza going on now for almost 7 months. And we also have a famine too.
Oh, the situation, and also when you visit Gaza itself, and obviously I hope that journalists will be allowed to go to Gaza, international journalists, sooner rather than later. When you see the situation on the ground, it is near apocalyptic. All the areas where houses were standing before are destroyed. We know the health facilities, more than 84% from damaged to totally destroyed. Everywhere you turn, everywhere you go, you see destruction. And above all, I think more importantly, there's human despair. People are huddled together in very dehumanizing conditions. No water, the garbage is collecting in the street. I mean, it's a long list, you know it all. Al Jazeera is reporting constantly. So it is more than grim. On top of that, of course, the number of people amongst the civilian population that are food insecure and living in near famine-like conditions, particularly in the north, are of course not only deeply troubling, it also calls upon us to try to do more to reach them, to do as much as we can. Because if you have been malnourished, either as a child or you're afflicted conditions of malnutrition, this is like a lifetime affliction. We've seen this in other country settings, but not like this. I keep trying to remember each time I go to Gaza, if I saw similar images of this level of destruction, for instance, in Syria. And it's very hard, and one has to be very careful to compare one country situation or a setting with another. So if I just focus on the Gaza Strip alone, I find it very, personally also very troubling to see that houses are no longer there. And when you drive through, when we go with these UN convoys, out of the rubble or in between the totally destroyed houses and streets filled with debris, people pop up. And you wonder, are they there to look for something in their old, place of dwelling? Are they staying around? Are they trying to pitch up a tent? It makes it even more eerie, I would say. But ultimately, what are people looking for? Safety, protection, roof over their heads, not a tent, water. They want to pick up their lives, and it's a very, very disturbing sight, so to speak. But again, I'm a visitor. We're trying to help. Ultimately, we have to place the civilians of Gaza at the center of all our efforts. It's not about us, it's about them.
Your colleague, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, has described the aspect of this, which is the famine, as a man-made famine tightening its grip. Is starvation, in your view, being used as a weapon of war?
I don't think I'm in a position to state it in that way. What we need to see, and that's the mainstay of my task, is to see that actually volume, diversity, the right level of goods, from food to medicine, health equipment, you name it, goes in and keeps going in, is allowed in, can be distributed, and it reaches the people. Of course, the months until the 5th of April, when there was very little supply going in, let alone reaching people, due to all the conditions on the ground, has left serious marks on the well-being of people. And as I just mentioned, children who've been malnourished, not only do they need therapeutic feeding, they need special support, but what I understand from medically qualified people, this leaves marks for a much longer time. It's not just a matter of, eating up a little bit or eating a little bit extra and you'll be fine. These are very serious afflictions. So our task, and I think that's also the imperative behind Resolution 2720, which I have to implement, is to scale up. And my focus is to achieve a paradigm shift. Significant numbers of people in Gaza are between food insecure as well as living in situations of near-like famine. We need to tackle that because indeed this is not a natural disaster and we have the means and we need to achieve it.
Let me ask you about the city of Rafah at the very southern end of the Gaza Strip on the border with Egypt. Normal population, 270,000 people. Now more than 5 times that number living there, about 1.5 million Palestinians. What are the conditions there like now?
Well, overcrowding, a lot of people daytime either looking for food, trying to find water, or perhaps going to the sea to wash themselves or their clothes. Every week you go, or every 2 weeks I've been, you see an increased number of tents. Roads are, as a result, also blocked. People are just desperately trying to get by. I imagine at the moment, if you're in Gaza, as many Palestinians in Gaza have told me, we're not living. We feel like zombies. We're just trying to get through the day, and the day is spent on trying to get the food, queuing for water, and if you're very lucky, maybe once a week or once a month, standing in a very long line to get a very limited amount of cash that you actually need to buy anything else. So life has been upended, and prospects are very, very grim.
And many of these people have come from different parts of the Gaza Strip. They've moved several times. This is their last place of refuge. And yet, this is the place where Israel says, despite protests from all around the world, including from the US, that it's going to carry out an offensive. What is your reaction to that? What would it mean for Rafah if that were to happen?
Well, I think from the UN side, not only are we stating very clearly and pleading for this operation not to take place, because it would compound an already profound humanitarian crisis into a catastrophe. People have no place to go. They're also weak. They're very vulnerable. I personally can't see a number of people even having the mental strength or the physical strength to pack up their belongings and move one more time. They've been told on a number of occasions to move. I'm not quite sure if they have as I said, the stamina to undergo this. For us, also, we don't even know if a Rafah operation were to happen, if we could reach people, if we actually are in a position to support them. So the strong political plea remains, don't.
Yeah, despite that, though, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the battle plans are all confirmed. He says there's even been a date set for this operation. Now, as you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't pick up the phone to your boss, Antonio Guterres. He's not spoken to him once since all of this started 7 months ago. He does talk to you, though, and you've met him a number of times, including a few days ago. Is he listening, at least, to the UN's concerns about the Rafah operation?
Well, I mean, I've had indeed a number of meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu and other members of his war cabinet, also separately. I like to think that our words and our observation of what we see and what we cannot support are very clearly heard. But I believe also that the Israeli war cabinet is making its own decisions.
Have they shared with you any proposals of how they plan to evacuate the people from Rafah?
I have not seen the plan. I know that in Jerusalem a number of my colleagues have been invited. I don't know if they've met already to to be appraised, so to speak, of what the Israeli government would call a humanitarian plan when it comes to the evacuation of civilians. But the UN, of course, is not enabling a war effort. So these are different conversations. I don't know the details of what is in the humanitarian plan, but you only have to look at Rafah and the density of the Gaza Strip, the levels of destruction, the fact that civilians have actually nowhere to go, to know what I said before, that this is compounding already a very profound and deep humanitarian crisis.
Throughout the war on Gaza, Israel has continually targeted hospitals, including two of the biggest hospitals, the Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, the Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, where mass graves have even been uncovered. How worried are you about the hospitals in Rafah, given that they are probably some of the only medical facilities still operating in the Gaza Strip?
Well, I think we're all profoundly worried. Whatever is still left standing or semi-functioning or partially functioning, there are only a few hospitals or medical facilities left to function. If these are also impacted or further damaged, this immediately affects the ability to actually meet the most basic needs in terms of healthcare of the civilian population. Now, if there's an operation and there are further civilian casualties, you also need trauma care. You need to have a place to go safely and be treated. There's a whole chain unfolding, which of course will be profoundly affected. We've seen a number of field hospitals. When I was in Gaza last week or a few days before that, I visited, for instance, the IMC field hospital, who have formidable trauma care under very difficult circumstances. But of course you don't want to go there. You do not want to be in a position where you have additional casualties, additional children being wounded, their caretakers, their parents or others. That's why, as you know, the UN's position is very clearly to implore to not undertake the Rafah operation, and strongly, I think, supported by most other international actors and countries alongside our call.
Let's talk about the delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza. In almost 7 months, only a trickle of the much-needed food, medicine and other supplies has gone in. I know perhaps there have been some recent slight improvements, but tell me, why is this aid not getting in? I've been covering this daily, and I really can come to no other conclusion than Israel is deliberately not letting it in.
The Israeli government has taken a number of measures, adopted commitments, from opening of crossings, diversification, extended working hours, repairs of Nahal Oz, water pipelines. This, I think, is a start, but it needs to be sustained and it needs to be expanded. The period before that, indeed, we were all asking for increase in the number of trucks, asking for some of the measures actually that have been adopted on the 5th of April. And we need much more.
You say that there was a change on April the 5th. That followed a phone call between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu on April the 4th, apparently a pretty tense phone call. Israel has now promised that it will allow aid to go through Erez in the north, for example, and use Ashdod port, which is just 34 kilometres from Erez. But the US officials had talked about flooding the zone. That's not happening, is it?
Yeah, well, the verb flooding the zone, I understand, but unless you benchmark it or you give a qualifying indicator to it, I think it's hard to say. What we're saying is we need a lot more. And we need a variety of goods, not just flour or basic medicine. It needs to be across the range, and it needs to be all over the Gaza Strip in a consistent manner. And whether we can then call it flooding or not flooding, I myself have used that verb before. I think what I'd like to get to is a metric. What do people need on a daily basis to actually have the essential elements they need for human dignity, to live? What do you need for protection? What do you need in healthcare? What do you need in food and more? That's where we're trying to put the metrics around, and then we can work our way back and say, okay, that's interesting. This is what's going in every day. I want to move everybody away from counting trucks. Counting trucks is a false metric. Some trucks are half empty, others don't get distributed properly or get looted. We need to see what reaches people. If it reaches civilians, they receive it, they can consume it, or they can use it, that's when we can start to measure about impact. That's what this is all about.
So do we have the immediate, safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance at scale? Why am I choosing that quote? Because it's from the resolution 2720, the one that set up your job. Israel's not complying with that resolution or two other Security Council resolutions or two provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice, the world's top body, is it?
We've spent a number of months trying to get to the point, I would say, of an increase in volume, inconsistency and sustainability. And it hasn't been easy, and ultimately it's not been easy, first and foremost and only for the civilians in Gaza. They have barely survived. And we see that in the levels of malnutrition, we see that in the injuries that they've sustained, and we see that in the absence of treatment. What we need to see and working towards is indeed to get to a place of safe and secure delivery. Some of these measures that were adopted are very important for that, but much more is needed, which is why I'm calling for a paradigm shift, and we can qualify that, which is in the Security Council. I listed a number of the measures that are either under implementation but need acceleration, or where we still need a lot of work and action. And I'll give you a very simple example. We may have filled trucks, but if they can't pass due to bad roads, they can't reach people. So we might have the volume, but unless you can reach people, you need all these elements to be fixed. And this requires acceleration and immediate follow-up, or continuous follow-up, by the Israeli authorities, and in this case by the IDF.
The US military love their acronyms. There's one here, JLOTS, the Joint Logistics Over the Shore. That's the pier that they're planning to build. Why is it necessary to bring aid in by ship? Isn't this a totally inefficient way of doing things?
Well, perhaps in other settings one would not immediately think of it. However, we've always said that all routes can lead to diversification and an increase of the type of assistance that can enter Gaza. I've always considered the Maritime Corridor, when it was first being discussed, as a potential avenue actually for recovery and reconstruction materials. In the period that passed, however, and with food insecurity levels being so high and fears of famine particularly affecting northern Gaza, the civilians there, discussions accelerated, and President Biden announced it in his State of the Union that the US would engage on building this pier. Now, the pier provides for an additional route to get aid into Gaza across the Strip. It can be beneficial. It's certainly not cheap, absolutely. Hence also the push will always remain to focus really on land, land, land. But the additional avenue of a maritime corridor can be helpful. That's why the United Nations also already from February has confirmed its willingness to be part of this endeavor under certain conditions and if certain parameters would be met. We have to sort of maximize all efforts and explore all avenues to reach people. That's what this is all about. Same for instance, the airdrops. One wouldn't necessarily think of it under any other circumstance, but it has happened. It's a response to despair and inability to reach people.
And just tell me about those conditions that the UN has. I'm told it's the World Food Programme that's going to be distributing this aid, not UNRWA, the UN agency that has the most capacity in Gaza to distribute aid. And isn't it a breach of the UN's neutrality and impartiality principles to be involved in an operation that's so closely tied to the US and Israeli militaries?
Well, this is precisely why we've engaged in extended discussions to ensure that parameters are obviously, in terms of our neutrality and impartiality and also safety and security, are met. And I'm not going to go divulge further details. I think we're nearly there, we hope so, but there are also other partners that are willing to be part of the effort to receive and distribute potentially a number of NGOs that have the same concerns, and the United States is very aware of these concerns and takes them very seriously. This is also why it's taken longer to step forward and say, okay, yes, we are part of this in terms of the distribution. But it's a critical element, and hopefully it will all be resolved because it will be addressed.
Over 200 humanitarian workers have died in Gaza so far in the war. That's the highest number in any recent conflict. That seems to be totally unacceptable. The majority of those who've died are Palestinian, but on April the 1st, a group of international aid workers from the World Central Kitchen were targeted and killed. All seven died in the attack. This must be particularly shocking for you, because you were in Gaza at the time and you met some of them hours before they died.
Yes, every innocent life that is lost is a tragedy, especially in war. It feels very senseless. And having met the two young professionals at the pier, because I went on a sort of first visit, first encounter, I was so struck by their pride, their sense of purpose, and I would say the very humble joy they took at being able and be in a position to actually, what they would say is, feed families in Gaza. And it is very strange to then wake up a number of hours later to hear actually that they passed. And we've seen also the international reaction and the outrage and the subsequent steps that have been taken. But my condolences and my hearts are with their friends and families, as with all humanitarian workers.
Let's talk about the reconstruction part of your job, because there was a recent report, it's called an interim damage assessment note from the World Bank and the UN, says 62% of all homes in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged, and it puts the estimated cost of it all at $13.3 billion. The scale of reconstruction is going to be massive. How long is it going to take, and who's going to pay for it?
Well, how long it will take, it depends all on the conditions, on access, on the permissive environment, on the return of the Palestinian Authority, on the political framework. As you know, many countries rightly say the investment required really needs to be based on the premise of the two-state solution and the clarity around the political framework that needs to be in place. At the same time, I think it is unconscionable to ask civilians in Gaza to wait for an outcome of a process that may take perhaps much longer than they actually should be asked to wait. Children need to go to school. They need to be schooled. They need to be learning. The early recovery and rehabilitation of hospitals and healthcare centers needs to happen. You can't ask people to wait 5 years for the rehabilitation of their hospitals. So these are also pressing needs now. But obviously a lot depends on the environment and whether goods are allowed in, if the investors are willing to be forthcoming. But there are Palestinian business leaders, there are large investors that also want to see how Gaza can be reconstructed. But of course it's always tied to the political framework. But I think it's incumbent upon the international community, be it with the studies, with the expertise, and of course also the UN being on the ground, that we push that agenda.
And you favour...
Otherwise you're telling the civilians in Gaza, the Palestinians, no, there's no hope for you. That cannot be an outcome of this conflict.
You favour the Palestinian Authority coming back. That's the stated position of yourself and the Secretary General. Israel opposes that. What do you do about it?
Well, I'm not quite sure if this is the moment in this interview to say what one does about it. It requires, of course, sustained political pressure, negotiations. I believe most countries have expressed and underlined the importance of the return of the Palestinian Authority, revitalized or reformed, or whichever of the R's you want to put as an adjective. And it's very important that governance is assumed with a view to tackling lawlessness, to provide for stabilization as well as stability, and to allow for the investments to start coming. Otherwise, I feel that we are condemning the Palestinians in Gaza to a continuation of a life in very, very dire circumstances.
You have visited, as we said, Gaza 4 times. You're now planning to establish an office in Gaza, and you're currently based in Amman, Jordan. You're planning to be based in Gaza. That must be a pretty daunting prospect.
If you assume the title and the role of Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator, I don't think you can do it from New York, not even Amman. I think one needs to be in Gaza very, very often, and then also use the experience and the discussions and the reality check from the ground to both influence, to advocate, and also propose and bring the different partners together. That, to my mind and in my experience, is the only way to do this credibly and be informed.
Finally, you've had a long career, as we've mentioned, as an international civil servant. In the mid-1990s, in one of your roles, you worked for UNRWA, the UN agency that deals with Palestinians in Jerusalem. That was at the time of the Oslo Accords. I'd like you to reflect on where we are now compared with that time of considerable hope.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, James. I often think about that because on the one hand, one has to be careful one doesn't sound like an aging person that says, oh, in the old days. But if we look at 2024, of course, one shouldn't forget that at the moment, Israeli families are deeply worried about the fate of their loved ones, the hostages inside Gaza. And once we try to tackle the urgent humanitarian needs of the Palestinian civilian population, we need a ceasefire. We need the immediate release of the hostages and a ceasefire. So whilst I can reflect on the last 30 years, my task at the moment is to work with these parameters and to keep echoing the importance of a ceasefire and the immediate unconditional release of the hostages so we can do our job, we can reach people, we can provide prospects, and perhaps also plant the seeds again of what will be a better era for the next generation.
Sigrid Kaag, Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza for the United Nations. Thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.